Good, we're recording. Thank you all for joining us. This is a 60-minute webinar with Dalouge Smith. It is being recorded, and thanks to our friends at El Sistema USA, it will be archived on their website. Both the originating article and the website address of El Sistema USA, where you and others can access this webinar recorded, are sitting there in your chat box. And we will try to include the web address of this recording in an upcoming issue of the Ensemble for those who weren't able to get that today. Thanks especially to Dalouge for taking the time and preparation to share these resonant thoughts with us, and to El Sistema USA for sharing the hosting with us and the archiving so that lots of people have a chance to hear it. A brief history of this particular article. Tricia and I have been in conversation with Dalouge forever, it seems, and these issues have often come up, the big thinking, whenever we get together. And over the summer, we invited Dalouge to put those thoughts together to share in an article for the Ensemble. And the article he sent us had so much resonance that we felt they warranted more than just an appearance in a newsletter. We thought these issues are so consequential and foundational that we thought we'd try this unconventional approach of a live webinar, recorded and archived, to further explore these thoughts. So that's the history behind today. Just a little bit of the mechanics. You may want to mute your microphone just so that we can keep our sound focus strong during this webinar. For those who haven't been on Zoom before, if you roll your cursor down to the bottom of the screen, you will find a few options, which include muting your microphone. And you'll also see an icon for the chat box, which I invite you to use throughout this seminar to ask questions, to make comments, to feel you have an ongoing way to get your thoughts expressed. I will be monitoring that chat box throughout the webinar, and then there'll be occasions during the webinar when we will invite your explicit participation. And to do that, you can either put a response in the chat box, you can wave your arms frantically, or you can unmute your mic so that you can just let us know you have something to say. So that's really all I have to say in terms of setup, and let me turn it over to Tricia Tunstall to introduce Dalouge.
Hi, everyone. I know that Dalouge is very familiar to most of us, but I'll just do a brief encapsulation of his experience to refresh your memories. For many years, Dalouge was the director of the San Diego Youth Symphony and Conservatory, and in this capacity, he founded the Community Opus Project, a Sistema-inspired program in Chula Vista, 5 miles from the Mexican border. And this program, I would say uniquely among Sistema programs, was able to move the entire school system of the district toward massive reintroduction of music education, which had been absent for years. So this wide-scale partnership with the public schools is something really unusual and significant in the Sistema national field, I think. And since last year, Dalouge has transitioned to a new position. He has been CEO of the Lewis Prize for Music, which is an organization that seeks to build more vibrant and fair communities through the catalytic force of music. So Dalouge I think has a kind of unique vantage point, combining all this experience from which to view our field. And I also must say, I think he has a unique capacity for reflection and insight and larger vision. So he has continually stimulated our field to think larger and more deeply in our national discussions. So Dalouge, over to you.
Thank you. So a couple of comments. First, this really should be a conversation. When I wrote the article, it was essentially intended to start a conversation. So I'm very appreciative to Eric and Tricia for proposing that we have this this webinar. And I think that as we all go through this conversation together, we think about what and how do we continue this conversation? Where do we take it next? How does this become a kind of recurring area of reflection and deliberation for our field, and ideally design of new action and new undertakings. So I'm just going to give a little bit of context as to the reasons that I finally wrote down what I did. There are a range of ideas that I'd been noodling on for a while, but hadn't distilled so succinctly previously, and had not actually realized that they, in a sense, represented what I think are a parallel set of principles to what we are all familiar with in terms of the programmatic principles of El Sistema work. So first, just full confession, I have never been to Venezuela. And that may actually be a slight advantage for me in that I don't have a direct immersion that becomes the kind of guiding reference point. My entire view of the work of El Sistema has kind of been refracted through many different sources, whether that's speeches by Maestro Abreu or Gustavo Dudamel, conferences, workshops, articles, Tricia's book, a whole range of content that I've had to essentially look at the many parts from many angles, almost in a cubist way, without actually having a direct view myself. And so all of that I've derived and the ways that we worked in Chula Vista were very much a consequence of that aspect of my experience. So over the last 10 years in the United States, I think that we have very well articulated and practiced the programmatic applications of El Sistema USA, or of El Sistema. And those are most explicitly articulated, I think, in two places. One is the original set of 8 principles that's now grown to 10 principles that the original Abreu / Sistema Fellows and Eric created during the first year of the New England Conservatory Fellowship. And the second set of reference points we have are the El Sistema USA membership criteria. There's a lot of overlap between those two, and they predominantly represent how our programs operate at the community level. Strong examples of musical excellence, the program setting, the work of ensemble, the instructional practices of intensity as well as continuity, and then of course the access and social change elements. But those all tend to be replicable or manifestable in the context of a direct instructional setting. They have not actually articulated how the larger elements of El Sistema in Venezuela fit together on the national scale. The reason that I actually started to think about these scaling elements is because our mandate at San Diego Youth Symphony by our board of directors was to make music education and accessible for all. And I could not see a means of doing that by solely providing the program. My belief was that was only going to happen if we actually helped the school system, where young people already were spending their day, prioritize music and education. Ultimately, that became music and arts education. And in fact, we successfully did that and helped that school district go from 0 visual and performing arts teachers to now 90 visual and performing arts teachers teaching in school every day for all 30,000 elementary age students in California's largest elementary school district. The approach that we took was so effective that actually Lauren Whitney, who became Lauren Shelton, she was hired by the school district after we helped from her vantage inside the San Diego Youth Symphony, helped them rebuild their internal capacities for hiring music teachers, citing them in schools. They actually hired her to do all of that on behalf of the district, and she has grown their work to the scale of what it is today. So I've had to look at both what we did, but also continue to look at how her efforts within the school district continue to be challenged, and what are the elements that essentially need to be further advanced in order for that commitment by the school district to not just remain sound, but actually to thrive and produce music, young musicians in the same way that El Sistema does in Venezuela. So that's the background to why I've actually finally written some of this down, because I was essentially trying to puzzle something out that we were trying to do. And it was only through the puzzling of it out that I actually started to recognize the patterns.
So let's see. From there, why don't we go to the question of what are the main obstacles to creating the kind of sustainable and influential and consequential systema field in the US? What would you say? And at this point, I'd invite all the participants to join in, respond to Dalouge's comments, either on chat or by you taking the microphone. But Dalouge, why don't you start us off on that? What are the main things that stand in the way, which you were just speaking about?
So these are some of the elements that I articulated in the article. And I think these are probably elements that it has been harder, or simply the work in El Sistema, they've chosen not to highlight these elements as prominently as the program and the performance elements. But the overall continuity of talent development, the role of lessons and the role of master classes, the role of the experience of the individual learner is something that I think we've paid less attention to as a field. And we also know that there's a very substantial infrastructure for that here in the United States, but it tends to not be fully available to the young people that are served by the El Sistema field. Likewise, how has El Sistema structured its pipeline of opportunity from the local all the way to the national level, up to the national conservatories, but equally inclusive of the regional and state? In the United States, all of those are very decentralized. We don't have a singular system. And so what and how El Sistema work overlaps with the existing pipelines is another area that we have just begun. And I know last year at the El Sistema USA conference, we spent quite a bit of time exploring this, but it's definitely an area for further advancement. A couple of the others are areas where we essentially are working in an environment where there's already so much infrastructure, and yet that we have not committed to saying to ourselves, the way this infrastructure is set up, it is actually disadvantaging and marginalizing young people from cultural traditions and economic circumstances that don't directly align. And so what I mean by that is the music education ecosystem in the United States is built around instrumental music, orchestral music, band music, and choral music, with a very limited amount of opportunity for young people to actually pursue advanced music education in other musical genres. And so what and how do the standards and the approaches of El Sistema enable a greater continuity of opportunity for young people? In addition, the whole work of El Sistema to make instruments, sort of the what I would think of as almost the workforce development aspects of El Sistema, we've paid limited attention to. So I think when we look at the whole of the music and music education ecosystems in the United States, we in the El Sistema movement have a lot of opportunity to provide new ways of thinking and acting within those contexts, as well as new knowledge and new means of actually strengthening some of that practice to make it more universally accessible and culturally responsive and appropriate.
Dalouge, we have a question in from Liz Moulthrop. She is noting the obstacles that Patterson Music Project faces with funding, transient student populations, and turnover in public school leadership, maintaining relationships with systems over time, and finding teachers who will continue to train future teachers. Do you have thoughts? I mean, you certainly encountered those issues in your work. Do you have any thoughts about how we can be more effective given those kinds of impediments?
So, and I'm going to add to that. I think we also have a lot of transiency of our own teaching artists in our own programs. And so there's a real question that, for me, the kind of fundamental question is what you started with there, Liz, which is the stability of the relationship. And the way that we approached that initially in San Diego was to essentially work to have as many relationships as possible, so that we were not solely dependent upon the school site leader or the superintendent or the classroom teacher or the music teacher once we started to have music teachers, that we were essentially trying to create a community of people so that there became a culturally consistent belief in the importance of music in the lives of young people and the lives of the school settings. And that as a result, when there was a shift, the community remained stable, even if an individual relationship came in or out. And I'm sure that many of the programs have found that to be an essential aspect of their work, whether they're working in a school site or working with a partner at a community center. But it's more complicated in school settings because there's also such a hierarchical structure. And I think one of the other characteristics that we adopted in San Diego was we didn't let ourselves be confined to the hierarchy. So we essentially would surf up and down the hierarchy within the school system, so that, again, this notion of the relationship was with the whole and not with any one person or one role. And as a kind of independent, that's again another asset that we as El Sistema programs have. The fact that we are not inside the hierarchy actually gives us an immense amount of independence and a unique vantage point on all aspects of the work that's going on within a large system, no matter what that system is, school or foster youth, early childhood education, etc.
Dalouge, do you have any thoughts about that other issue you raised of aligning existing resources for young people? You refer to them as, an infrastructure of pipelines that are not well organized to serve the kids in Sistema programs. We've been hearing a little bit about the Philadelphia Music Alliance for Youth, which was an extraordinary effort to actually do that very thing, and how much energy it took and how they're accomplishing some things. Do you have some thoughts about how we might move that in a positive direction for Sistema programs?
So I think that the essential first step is to acknowledge that we are one in a larger system. I've always been concerned when I've seen Sistema programs essentially try to be everything. In other words, be the entire continuity. That is possible for a limited number of young people, but with the way that our society is developed, the United States is a decentralized governance society in total, from our federal government to our state governments, to our county governments, to our city governments, to our school districts. Like that's all, those are all separately governed. And that's just the nature of how our entire society has been built over time, which is very different from the centralized societies in South America and to some degree in Europe. So the whole practice of collaboration becomes both the practice of humility about, okay, what we do and what we don't do, and being really clear about that so that we can find others in our community or others on the national stage who are expert or are the kind of most resourced for a particular activity. I think the additional challenge to all that, and this is again where I think the scaling of El Sistema has to be done through more than literal practice, but has to be done through knowledge sharing, professional development, and relationship, is that we don't control all those others, but they're struggling too. The reason that there is such a strong push in the orchestral world for greater diversity is because there's a recognition that orchestras are not fully reflecting or fully serving their communities. And this is where El Sistema work has so much practice and so much to offer. And so I think if we really lean into the elements that are where we have the greatest strengths, those are both the sources of the kinds of outcomes that we want as a field, but they also are the sources of new practice for other parts of the ecosystem, so that they actually become more responsive and more responsible to their communities.
Dalouge, I'd like to follow up on that last remark you just said about that if we go about this correctly, we can actually see the institutions themselves start to change and be more available to communities. And I'm just wondering if you actually saw that in action in Chula Vista and how that looked.
I'm not sure what you mean. I mean, when you say saw that in action, you mean the school system being more responsive? Yeah,
I mean, system, the district, the the schools themselves.
So let me add to that, my answer to that, to say I think one of the other characteristics of the work that we all do in El Sistema that we are not naming for what it is we are doing community organizing work, and there is a huge body and history of community organizing practice that we are sort of intuitively undertaking, but we're not connected to that practice as well as we could be or should be. Part of the reason that I've come to recognize that is, as I've learned more about community organizing, this example I'm going to give, I realized was a community organizing moment, but I didn't know that's what we were doing. I just thought I was supporting the parents. So as our students mature, the very first group of students matured out of the elementary school into what is a separate secondary system, a large group of them went to one middle school that did not have music. And they essentially asked me, the parents asked me to join them in meeting with the principal to make the case for more music. Thankfully, there was a principal there who believed in music, but that meant that she knew there was a community that wanted it, and that she wasn't going to be on her own in trying to offer it or create a culture for it. And so she started to take the steps. The first year was an after-school program, just like ours had been. But by the second year, those kids were in the 8th grade. She had a music teacher on campus, and that then helped restore the music programs at the high school level. So the fact that the parents wanted it and spoke up for themselves, to me, was both a demonstration of community effort, but also a forcing or a calling upon the system to be responsive to the community.
That's a great answer.
Dalouge, how about some of those other points in your article? Let's introduce them and see which may be interesting for our participants.
Sure. So I had 5 basic points that I named as principles of scaling, and the question that still is sort of rattling around my head is, did I name them all? So I welcome additions, absolutely, and refinements. So the 5 areas that I identified were the overall engagement with educational systems. We've just spent a lot of time talking about that, and so I don't want to go into any depth, but we need to acknowledge that young people in our country from age 5 to 18, for the most part, are all in school. So in our 10 years of the El Sistema movement in the United States, we have programs that are serving 20,000 young people, when we know there are millions of young people in school systems who don't have music. So if we can infuse those systems with El Sistema principles and the valuing and prioritizing of music, the way we were able to do in Chula Vista, then we're going to see a massive transformation in scale of both music, but again, the imperative of the El Sistema principles being coupled and embedded with that work. The other area where I think there is large system possibility is in early childhood, as well as in serving differently abled children. And we know that those have become and are priorities in Venezuela. They have not manifested as strongly as priorities in the United States. And I think that that's an area for us to all sort of reflect on for ourselves. Where and how can we begin to take our principles that we're using for the work with elementary through high school students and seek to have those become equally present in the lives of very, very young children and their families, as well as the differently abled students. And I will say that in Chula Vista, once we got, first of all, we fully integrated differently abled kids into the Opus project from the beginning. And we have seen that the school district has provided music education universally to the special needs students, just as they have everyone else. And it's made some transformative impacts across the community for those children, for those families, for those campuses. The whole question of music educator training and having young people who come out of our programs aspire to being music educators, but then also making sure that the path that they take is not ultimately a marginalizing or discriminatory path. And I think that's a huge question and concern. I don't think it's accidental that there are, of all the music educators across the country, certified music educators, 10% are people of color. I think that there's more and more evidence coming out about the nature of a college experience, and how, unless there's an explicit effort to overcome historic discrimination, that experience continues. And I suspect that it may be strong in music departments because of such a fixation on Western musical traditions, that you essentially have to perform to those traditions in order to succeed. The fourth is young leadership, and we've all marveled at the kind of each one teach one efforts and culture in El Sistema, but I don't think we have fully manifested it here in the U.S. And I don't know if I will acknowledge I don't fully understand how to manifest it, partly because I'm not a teacher, but also because I think that it's an area that we've not developed a pedagogy for. We have amazing musical pedagogy. I'm not sure that we have a parallel, at least in our El Sistema programs or in music education. I'm not sure that we have a parallel pedagogy for youth development and youth leadership development. And I think that's an area for us to lean into. And then the last is this whole notion of knowledge sharing, professional development, being a source of new practices, being a source of new methodologies that are not just musical, but as I was saying earlier, are also about our relationships with community, connecting up more explicitly with community organizing culture and practices, and codifying how that intersects with our El Sistema work. So those are the 5 principles that I had suggested are the preliminary foundations for scaling in the United States based on what we've seen achieved in Venezuela.
Let's invite our participants to either comment on any of those 5, or, as you offered earlier, suggest that you may be missing a whopper. There may be a big idea that belongs in that set that just didn't happen to fall into a top 5 for you. So participants, this is where you can just chime in with an unmuted microphone or drop a note into the chat box column in response to Dalouge's key principles for sort of expanding Sistema's influence.
And might I add, Eric, that if there are examples of something that's underway, let's name it and let's start to associate it with these principles, so that they don't look like a sort of independent outlier, but we start to recognize them for bearing some potential for the whole of the field.
Hi, this is Helen Chapia with Patterson Music Project. My video is giving me a hard time, so I'm just going to do audio. Can you hear me?
Go for it.
How are you? It's very, very helpful article, and I really appreciate these 5 points. I just wanted to go deeper, perhaps, with you on number too. You know, what you have said, and Liz, I think, posed a question earlier just about our difficulty of finding that right teaching artists to work with our students on a daily basis, you know, who can really practice culturally responsible teaching and who's well versed in different styles of music and, you know, cultural language in their whole background. It's really difficult to find that even in our metropolitan area here in New Jersey and New York. And now that our PMP students have entered a ninth grade and they're in high school, we're really thinking deeply about how to set them on the right path for, you know, the pipeline to the higher education. And I think that bullet point number 2 might be worth kind of dividing it into, first of all, finding and training those potential teaching artists who may be already trained in a conservatory or a music education field, and now coming out of that, and that we have to train them through many different PDs and our own kind of a cultural advocate for our community. But then the second thing is to have our students go into a higher education, perhaps where we as an organization can build a bridge with a local, either state university that may have a strong music education program. So for our situation, there's John Kelly School of Music at Montclair State University that already are some of our students participate in a Saturday program. Also, Rutgers University has a strong music education program that we might be able to somehow, you know, enter into that relationship. And I guess, you know, as kind of the first timer in our region to set that up, I wonder if you have any suggestions for that. You know, I mean, there's some obvious things, you know, talking to the university itself and somehow, you know, set up some sort of a scholarship program, but also maybe perhaps talking about the diversity in the training and the curriculum that they currently have, so that it's not so Western classical music oriented, but really venturing out to reflect the communities where their graduates will be serving after getting their music education degree. So I know there's some really awesome, you know, examples that we saw through kind of Orchids and down in with Interlochen and with our students from Miami Project. You know, so hearing on the national level, the organizations that are about 10 years with the high school students, it was very encouraging. But I just wanted to see if there were some maybe bullet points that, you know, we can take away and think about in approaching these institutions as a program of El Sistema USA.
Thanks, Helen. Just before Dalouge responds, let me mention that this is the #1 challenge that is cited by Sistema programs around the world, is finding faculty that has the right feel for their work and keeping a steady supply of them and and sort of growing a pipeline for future. Anyway, Dalouge.
So I think that, first of all, your identification of a local university resource with a music, and I'm assuming a music education program, is spot on in my view. And I think that so there are some specific things I think that we need to do first, right? And as a field, we need to, like, I'm gonna say you for a second, Helen, like you and Liz, you guys are really clear about what it is that you have to offer, but then likewise, what it is that you want from that local university partner. And I would think that there's actually a range of dimension in both directions, right? In terms of what you have to offer, you've got a whole field or body of practice that you can bring to them to help their current music education students actually get immersed or practiced in serving a diverse community that might be different from what they can get through their standard teacher training, certification steps, things like that. But then likewise, I think finding the person or people there, whether it is actually the music education professor, I think is an open question. If I'm not mistaken, there's a composer at Montclair who's just recently had an opera produced in Cincinnati. He's African-American. He's Lloyd Richards' son, and I'm blanking on his first name. Lloyd Richards was the first director to mount August Wilson plays through August Wilson's career.
I'm not aware of that. That's great. Okay.
I'm naming that to say that just like in our local work with our partners, we need to find those affinity people. And those affinity people then help us navigate their system, but they also help us identify what we have to offer and what they have to offer. And so, I think naming the circumstance is a first step, and you've already done that. Naming what you believe are the important elements of the solution, and you've named some of that. It might be that some of what we're talking about here addresses that, and actually making it about more than your specific program, but saying, look, we're an indicator of a bigger problem. And so if you can demonstrate the generosity of, we're trying to do this for all kids. Our program is one example of that, but we have our New Jersey peers all across the state. We've got, urban and suburban school districts all across the state. Like, this is a need that is going to be on a much bigger scale than our singular program. That's how you actually start to shift the kind of cultural orientation or the priority orientation of a partner organization, so that they just like we do with our kids, they see themselves as part of a bigger pursuit. I think that's the kind of dynamic that you want to develop with them, so that you are together solving a big problem.
Right. I think that's very helpful, and especially with our New Jersey El Sistema Alliance that is exemplified with Tricia's leadership, and all 7 programs that are really functioning as kind of an organization and already doing things together. I can see creating kind of a larger ecosystem in which all of our students already know that they're counterparts in different cities throughout the country. I mean, throughout the state of New Jersey, and across the state, approaching these, especially state universities. And
right.
Also, I forgot to mention, William Patterson University already has, sent some, student teaching through a professor that had started a band program in Patterson. And then since then we kind of took over, but she still oversees field studies essentially for her students to come out to be teaching assistants to our teaching artists. So there's a very basic kind of a relationship going on. But I really like the fact that, now that we, with the across the state kind of creating that ecosystem, it's a bolder kind of movement, but I think it really will benefit all of our children here in the state. So,
well, and let me just add also that I know from working in California, and I'm assuming the same is true in just about every state in the country, there is a strong certified music educator association in just about every state, all being under the umbrella of the National Association for Music Education, NAFME. They are not, I'm going to generalize, this is not absolutely true in every community, but I'm going to generalize to say they are not figuring out very quickly how to be responsive to a more and more diverse student population. And that is a space where I think El Sistema work is way ahead of them. And so again, not necessarily as in an oppositional way at all, but more of identifying where and how what is going on in El Sistema work is a resource of knowledge and a resource for practice. And whether that new knowledge starts to get shared through the music educator training at the university levels, whether that gets shared in professional development sessions at the state conferences, or whether that actually gets infused in in the way we work with our young people. I really firmly believe that the connection between developing youth leadership and developing future music educators is very, very tight. I mean, we know that's the case from Venezuela. And so the attentiveness that we give to that work can, over the long term, also, I believe, feed this challenge space that we all have around music instructors.
Dalouge, I would like to add, we have a note from Vanessa that reinforces what I know happens in a lot of programs, where she is citing that her program in Orlando, Florida, A Gift for Music, works with a local University of Central Florida to have music education students there teaching in internships in her program, for which they receive scholarship aid from the university. And do you have a sense of this? I mean, I have a sense that this is fairly widespread. Usually individuals, 1 or 2 or 3 from a local university music education department, will have a little toehold in a program, will make appearances. Can you think of examples or ways to muscle up that infrastructure that some people are finding and turn it into the sustainability thinking you're bringing?
So I think that, so there's sort of 2 directions I can think about the muscling up of that. The first is, are those young people who are serving as the intern or student teachers in our programs, are they also bringing what they're experiencing back to their university peers? Are they bringing those, is the work that they're doing in our context or in our settings, or are our faculty members joining them and they're, in a sense, leading some training for their own peers? I don't know if that's the case or not. Or, but I feel like this goes again to the question of developing student leadership. That the young teachers, the young teaching artists and or certified teachers in training, they'll get energized if they feel like they're actually developing something that gives them a level of expertise. I mean, it's just like with our students, right? If we teach them something and we teach them to teach somebody else, they get energized by that. I think it's the same with student teachers in all likelihood. I don't have evidence to guarantee that, but so that's one aspect, right? Is how can the presence of those young people, how can they actually become the carriers of knowledge and practice back into those university settings? The second is, what I believe is also common is that we find an individual that we have a partnership with at a university, and that essentially becomes a binary. And so my other thought or recommendation is, with the bandwidth we have, which we know is narrow, how can that person within that university setting essentially open up space for us to bring our knowledge in? So whether that means they're going to host even just a luncheon to just say, hey, all my faculty friends, let's all have lunch together and let's just hear about what they're doing down the street at this program and what some of our students are doing there. But essentially, how can we get those partners to help us become more literally present in their space on their campuses?
And for participants, you'll notice some helpful comments from Josh DeVries at El Sistema USA in the chat box. Dalouge, I have noticed in a number of programs in other countries, they make an explicit and dedicated effort to training students to be teachers even as they're in their Sistema program. Mm-hmm. They're actually sort of inextricable in that the teaching and the learning are built in so that students will be naturally inclining toward education. Do you have any thoughts about that practice in the US?
So we're at the point now where we're sort of seeing our first waves of students go into colleges. For like our very first class of students in Chula Vista are seniors in high school right now. So I think that the question that's an open question is, have we done that? I don't know the answer. I don't know. There are other programs, particularly in Baltimore and LA, where they have graduates who are several years ahead of most other programs. And so they may have a little bit better sense of that. what it takes to inspire that career choice. And I don't know if we've fully set ourselves up well to support those young people as they're making that choice. I mean, we do know that we are gaining more attention from university settings, but I don't have enough direct experience or evidence to say we're doing it well, we're not doing it well. I think that's a question for us to investigate.
And just sort of on that same thread, Laverne Sprill comes in from Georgia saying that his big challenge, or her big challenge, I'm sorry, is getting in tune with the student schedules, because the student schedules are very rigid and fixed, and so they have to kind of fit in with the student schedules.
Meaning at the university level, I think.
Yeah, which raises the question of needing to not only get into or get connected with those places, but also actually have an effect on the priority of those places, so that they structure their students' learning experiences to prioritize being able to do this.
Right.
So I have one example from Montclair State University. I was there for 2 years as a visiting professor, so I was able to see the activities of the NAFME student chapter. And it was very interesting. The leaders of NAFME student chapter in the education department there were also very active members of diversity in the music school. And so those two group leaders were often doing activities on campus. And I thought it was very interesting. And now just listening to this conversation is giving me some sort of an idea to reach out, not really, like you said, not always to the professors, but to these pre-organized NAFME chapters students, and also ASTA student chapters, to see if they might be interested in really helping to line up some sort of activities with our students, either doing a site visit to our school or not. But when you mentioned, Luke, about NAFME, that gave me a really interesting idea, just because I was there watching that, how student leadership in this particular situation overlapped with students of color who were really trying to create more diversity in the School of Music there. And I don't know if there's any kind of correlation. It might be just one kind of a singular experience. But for our students at PMP, they could pretty much, really access some role models, who are actually pursuing this career as a music teacher. Just wanted to share that.
Dalouge, we have an interesting suggestion coming in from Stanford Thompson. Stan, join us with another way of thinking about addressing this pipeline challenge.
Sure. So I just, being here in Philadelphia, seeing how Settlement Music School, the school district, how all of that stuff created Curtis, how a lot of conservatories and schools of music really started copying how everybody else was set up. I'm just seeing that it's going to take a really long time for these systems to change. So kind of like all of our Sistema programs are really kind of reimagined community music schools that I believe just match more of the realities of what our communities are facing. So instead of trying to fix an old system that we might not be able to fix, why not just continue to create a new one? Continue to create Interlockens and Tanglewoods and Brevards, more national youth orchestras in addition to the one in LA. Why not think about our own certification like Suzuki does, but be very specific about what people need to do in the pedagogy and all of that stuff. That also includes things like cultural competency. Might there be a network of music schools and conservatories that we create? A kid can get a degree from the Atlanta Music Project Conservatory and be certified to teach in our programs and have a freelance career like all of our teachers have. Does it have to be from a place like Curtis? Because in many ways, that degree doesn't mean anything. You still have to go to an audition and play, and quite frankly, they don't care where you come from. And then same thing with semi-professional and professional ensembles. Again, create that entire ecosystem across the country from scratch, or do we really think that we're going to, again, change this deeply ingrained system that we're all kind of pushing against?
So my response to that is to say, if we ultimately have to build a parallel alternate system because the others are non-responsive, then we'll need to do it. If the others are non-responsive, they are actually probably attaching themselves to a lot of historical discriminatory culture that is going to undermine them in many, 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 many ways, not just in relation to music or music education. So I guess my feeling is, if we start with some of what you described, Stanford, in terms of a standardization of our knowledge and practice, whether that's a certification, we might find that we want to, well, for example, Longy, I mean, there's an example. Longy Conservatory has created a Master of Teaching in Arts that's an El Sistema inspired teaching certificate, right? And it couples in-school and out-of-school experiences. That is now a new option. I'm going to sort of share a slightly parallel example. Here in San Diego, there's a high school called High Tech High. They created their own teacher certification program because they wanted to train teachers in project-based learning, which is not what you learn when you go to the standard state teachers college. So that absolutely is an option for us. I think the step that comes first is the naming and the refining of our practices such that we can, in a more uniform way, actually spread them and share them and give them scale. Like I don't think they become scalable until we've actually done work to codify them.
Eric, if I can jump in,
yeah.
I'm so happy to have so much input from everyone around Dalouge's ideas, and thrilled to have Dalouge on the board. What we're talking about now are some of the ideas that El Sistema USA is putting forth in our 2025 strategic plan. And I just want to invite this group to both respond to a survey we'll be sending out with some of these very ideas that have been mentioned, including a certification for teachers in El Sistema training to be offered by El Sistema USA and a university partner. And also the concept of building new systems for our students so that we're growing our own systems change, and partnering within the existing systems of traditional music opportunities. So building out more opportunities like the one that we have with the Peabody Conservatory at Johns Hopkins, where we're creating El Sistema USA full scholarships there, and seeking other university partners to offer really that extended pipeline of the training that we're all doing on the ground for kids in our local communities, and then building that up through partnerships, making sure that every step of the way is covered, that we're not losing the traction of all of the work that has gone in locally.
Can I comment on actually also so we've spent a lot of time focusing on teachers and teacher development. And I think that's an imperative just for our own programs to continue to grow and literally be stable. Like, we know that that's a vulnerability that exists for us. And I think we as a field have paid less attention to music educator training. And in fact, the distinction between being a teaching artist and being a certified music educator is explicit in a kind of, you're certified, you're not certified, but the training actually is also quite different. And I think part of the challenge that we face is we are currently relying heavily on people who are getting a instrumental or other kind of conservatory focused training and not an educational training. And so that in some respects, what Helen was describing earlier about, we have to do a lot of additional PD with them. That's because they are not trained in a particular pedagogy necessarily, I'm assuming, certainly not as well trained in culturally responsive curriculum or in even doing work with diverse populations. First, to say our field is not alone in that. Like that's a challenge that all education is facing. But also, I tend to believe that the initiatives that are underway, that Yale's issuing of its manifesto is trying to push that conversation. Equally, other educational subject areas, for most particularly the social studies subject area, is essentially working hard to rewrite what the standards are. And I think we should assume that that wave will come to music education. And we can either be the forefront of that wave, or we can let it happen independent of us and try to work in parallel. I tend to believe that that's going to be, that we are most well positioned to actually define a lot of the way in which that evolution happens. It's though NAFME is not at a high speed working on this issue, they are working on it, and they will experience greater pressure to work on it. And I think also Helen's point about the young students of color who are trying to pursue music education, the more that we resource them now, the more they will be prepared to push that. And ultimately, they will continue to view us as a resource for that kind of affinity, or, you know, ally, their ally in that effort. And so I'm confident that we as a society are actually making new explicit priorities around equity and diversity and inclusion. And my contention is that we in El Sistema, in the El Sistema movement, are perfectly positioned if we essentially accelerate our rate of codifying and naming our scale ambitions, that we will ultimately be able to become the source for all that new evolution in the music education field.
Dalouge, with that strong declarative sentence you just ended with, we have to end our time. I want to respect the time frame we gave to our participants, and that was really a good closing note. I will point out for our participants, and we'll let them know again later, that you and Tricia will be sharing further thoughts and further...
We've proposed. I don't know if we've...
Sorry, it's just a proposal that this conversation may, if all things work out, continue at the El Sistema USA Symposium. So thanks to all who joined, and thank you, Dalouge, particularly for putting your thoughts together for us today. Thank you all.
Thank you.